Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the third episode of Chanakya Neeti. In today's episode, we shall make an attempt to understand Kautilya's Shadgunya or Sadgunya Siddhant for warfare and diplomacy. This is part of a new limited series which has been launched by Unacademy IAS English. Under Chanakya Neeti, we are making an attempt to help you understand Chanakyan thought and Kautilyan philosophy and how you can apply that in contemporary geopolitics. These episodes go live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. So don't forget to tune in. And if you guys are finding this initiative to be interesting and if you want more such interesting sessions, do let us know in the comments and don't forget to press the like button to support our initiatives. Initiatives such as these will help you not only in your GS papers, especially for international relations, internal security, etc. It will also help in your optional subjects such as PSIR, public administration and the others. So we hope these initiatives are beneficial to your preparation, and if you are finding them useful and if you want us to continue, do let me know in the comments and don't forget to press the like button. Now, before we start, you might remember in the last two episodes, we have understood a few basic details about Kautilyan thought. We have spoken about how Kautilya came out with pragmatic, realistic and even ruthless advice to the king in order to protect the interests of the state. Kautilya has often prioritized the interests of the state, that is the kingdom, and the interests of the king, even over ethics, principles and values. This makes Kautilya one of the leading strategists who had a pragmatic view of things back in ancient times. We also discussed in previous episodes how several experts often compare Kautilya with Machiavelli and incorrectly refer to Kautilya as the Indian Machiavelli. I told you why we disagree with this assessment, because Kautilya not only predates Machiavelli, but his thought was much more comprehensive, much more holistic and realistic and ruthless when it comes to geopolitics, warfare and diplomacy. So in this regard, there is a very popular statement regarding the comparison between Kautilya and Machiavelli. This statement was made by a very popular leader or an expert. Now I want you guys to guess who made this popular statement. When we look at Kautilya's king, Machiavelli's prince appears harmless. Now this statement is a clear assessment of Kautilyan thought and a comparison with Machiavelli's the prince, and how Kautilya's thought, which was provided centuries before Machiavelli's thought, was not only pragmatic and realistic but was also ruthless as a strategic advice to the king. Now can you tell me in the comments who made this popular assessment regarding the comparison between Kautilya's king and Machiavelli's prince? Was it Nehru or Max Weber or Henry Kissinger or Woodrow Wilson? Please let me know in the comments. Now before we start, I have a very important announcement for 2026 aspirants. Our new batches in the English medium are all set to begin from October 11th, and do enroll for the classes if you are interested, if you are preparing for the 2026 attempt, as you are able to get the course at a discounted price of 24,999. This is a comprehensive online course where you can attend live classes by our top educators, along with getting prelims and mains test series, one-on-one mentorship and even doubt resolution sessions. So if interested, you can enroll for the free counseling in order to meet and discuss with your educators, and the counseling form is provided in the video description. So fill out the details in the counseling form to get in touch with us, and based on that you can enroll for the program. So with this, let's begin our discussion. In the last episode, we spoke about one of the key theories that Kautilya propounded in the Arthashastra regarding war. I explained in episode number 2 how Kautilya advised the king to avoid war as much as possible, because Kautilya had the farsightedness to realize that wars are not only expensive and cost prohibitive, wars can weaken a kingdom. it can distract the kingdom from administration and governance, and it could eventually give very bad or poor results, which could undermine the legitimacy of the king itself. So Kautilya suggested that wars are inevitable. Wars might happen. You may have to fight these external conflicts with the enemy, but always try to avoid war through clever diplomacy, through the 4 upayas that we studied in the last episode. And he also recommended, if the 4 upayas of diplomacy fail, then he suggested a 6-fold policy of diplomacy and non-war pressure or coercive diplomacy, along with warfare tactics. A mix of diplomacy, non-war pressure and warfare tactics was suggested under a 6-fold policy, which is popularly referred to as Sadgunya or Shadgunya. These 6 principles brought out by Kautilya in the Arthashastra provides different tools and different options for a king or a leader to avoid a full-fledged war and try to protect the interests of the nation. But of course, in certain instances, wars are inevitable. In such cases, Kautilya recommended that you should not only rely on covert options to weaken and destabilize the array or the enemy, but also ensure that you resort to the maximum possible military force to weaken the enemy and defeat the enemy to achieve your national interests. But in this regard, with regard to engaging in war with the neighbors or the enemies, Kautilya suggested that the king should be mindful of the long-term consequences. Avoid war as much as possible if it is counterproductive. Treat the opponent who might be defeated with respect and leniency and generosity, so that you don't create lifelong enemies, you don't create new reasons for the opponents to breed hatred and animosity against the state. So these advices given by Kautilya, the strategies, the options that was presented by Kautilya in the Arthashastra was absolutely vital advice given to the king, and this remains relevant even in today's geopolitics. Even today, if you look at the ongoing conflicts, the ongoing diplomatic choices that India faces, we can learn lessons from Kautilya's thought and apply that in contemporary geopolitics. So over the next few minutes, let's quickly understand what are the 6 principles of this 6-fold policy. This includes the principle of Sandhi, or establishing peace treaties with your opponents and arrees to prevent a war from happening, to try and establish a basic decent relationship even with the arrees. It includes Vigraha, the eventual option to resort to force, to go to war if necessary. If the war is pushed upon us, the state has to fight back to protect its interests, and Kautilya recommended war as an option, but as a last resort with certain checks and balances. Then Asana, to adopt a position of neutrality. Yana, to use coercion through military mobilization and covert operations to weaken the opponent. Samshraya, to form alliances with like-minded countries to deal with mutual threats. And finally, Dvaidbhava, or the policy of duplicity, the diplomatic double game that countries often play in order to hoodwink your enemies and your arrees. So these are the 6 principles laid down by Kautilya under Shadgunya Siddhant, also called the 6-fold policy, that provides few non-warfare tactics and as well as diplomatic tactics and warfare tactics in order to protect the interests of a state. So let's understand these principles one by one with contemporary examples from Indian foreign policy and global geopolitics. I think that is what makes this interesting discussion, which you can directly apply in your exams as well. This also broadens your understanding of international relations. So let's start with Sandhi, or peace or treaties. Kautilya suggested to the king that the king should first assess the enemy, assess the opponent. Before you pick hostilities and enmity with a rival, especially with the Ari states, who might be your neighboring states, the king has to be mindful of the military and economic capabilities of the enemy. The king needs to assess with his advisors whether the opponent is superior or inferior to us. This assessment is very crucial before you escalate the tensions further. Kautilya suggested to the king that this assessment should also factor in geographical conditions, because certain countries might have a geographical advantage. Certain countries might have a military or an economic advantage or a combination of these three. Without carrying out this assessment, if a state were to escalate tensions, this could end up being disastrous. So in this assessment, if you determine that your opponent is superior to you, if your Ari has a geographical advantage in case of a war, or if your Ari has a military or economic superiority compared to us, then Kautilya advised to the king that you need not escalate the tensions, because in case of a war with a superior power, chances are we are going to lose. This would be cost prohibitive. It will hit the economy of the kingdom. The kingdom might even lose territory, and it could even lead to the collapse of the state. So Kautilya advised to the king to focus on diplomacy in such a scenario. If the assessment clearly states that the opponent is superior geographically or through military and economic strength, Kautilya's strong advice to the king was that if you are in a weaker position, ensure that you use diplomacy to prevent war, to prevent further rise in tensions. Engage with the opponent to try and work out a peace treaty to accommodate the interests of the opponent. Now use this opportunity as a time buying tactic. Once you strike peace with the opponent through some treaties, through Sandhi, don't sit idle. The king was advised by Kautilya to actively work on improving the strength of the kingdom. If there was a military or economic disadvantage, the kingdom has to ensure that in the coming years, where sufficient time has been bought through the peace treaty, the kingdom has to work towards improving its military and economic strength to bring parity in the relationship with the enemy, so that tomorrow, 5-10 years down the line, if tensions break out, if the peace treaty falls apart, you should be in a better position to counter your opponent. If there are geographical disadvantages, you should use the time bought through a peace treaty to correct those geographical disadvantages. This is what Kautilya recommended to the king, and this advice is pure gold in diplomacy. We see this being applied in contemporary geopolitics as well. For example, during the 1962 war, prior to the war broke out between India and China, if the then Nehru administration had drawn lessons from Kautilyan thought, possibly the war may never have happened. Because the Nehru administration is often blamed with overestimating India's capabilities and underestimating China's capabilities. Assessments clearly showed China had a military, geographical and economic advantage. Because of the Tibetan plateau, where China had created better infrastructure, it was able to easily mobilize more weapons and more troops. For every one Indian soldier, China had brought in 3 soldiers. The ratio was 1:3 when tensions were escalating in late 1950s. So China clearly had a geographical and a military advantage. And assessments clearly showed India's military weakness. We didn't have dedicated mountain warfare divisions. We didn't have sufficient military equipment, and our forces weren't adequately trained in high altitude warfare. The military advice was very clear to not escalate, to not go aggressive against China, but to take a step back and to focus on Sandhi, to focus on a peace treaty. But instead, the Nehru administration, along with then Defense Minister V.K. Menon, they went ahead with a forward policy for which Prime Minister Nehru has been blamed, as this led China to retaliate against India. As India got aggressive in its forward deployments against China, China decided to hit back at India, starting the 1962 war. So probably if the lesson had been learned that you should correctly assess your opponent, You should have a realistic assessment of your own capabilities first, and then accordingly, if you feel that the opponent is superior to you, if they have some sort of geographical, military or economic advantage, we should take a step back. You should keep your egos aside, you should keep wrong assessments aside and focus on what is practically achievable, because a war will have disastrous consequences, and we saw that in 1962. India not only suffered a humiliating defeat eventually, but China occupied Aksai Chin and holds Aksai Chin even today illegally. So these are vital lessons that need to be incorporated into diplomacy and warfare. Now look at the recent tensions regarding the Doklam standoff that occurred in 2017, when Chinese PLA was seen to be building road, or illegal road in Bhutan's territory at Doklam Plateau, which is a strategic location at the tri-junction of India, Bhutan and China. Indian troops challenged the illegal road construction by the Chinese troops, because Doklam is a disputed site between China and Bhutan, and as part of the 1949 treaty between India and Bhutan, India has an obligation to protect and defend Bhutan against external threats. So as India objected to Chinese road construction at Doklam, it escalated into a major military flashpoint. Both sides brought in reinforcements and it turned into a big escalation, and it appeared as if India and China were prepping for war. But the Modi government clearly realized that China does have an advantage. This was not the time for war. Be it in terms of military or economic strength or the geographical advantages, China clearly had an edge, and there was no point in escalating further. So Prime Minister Modi reached out to Chinese Premier Xi Jinping after all the other peacemaking initiatives had failed. India and China tried all the other existing arrangements, including talks between senior military commanders and senior government officials and ministers. But all these talks failed and they fell apart. Eventually, PM Modi pushed Xi Jinping to agree for an informal summit at Wuhan, which finally led to a breakthrough. So this is a classic example of Sandhi. We worked out a peace arrangement following which both India and China agreed to disengage and de-escalate and pull out the troops from Doklam, leading to some stable relations for few years between the two countries. Now let's look at the second principle, Vigraha or war, the other extreme in diplomacy and warfare tactics. Kautilya suggested to the king that if all forms of diplomacy, covert operations, coercive diplomacy has failed, and if it is in the genuine interest of the state, of the kingdom, and if the king enjoys an advantage over the enemy, then going to war is justified. It is seen as a just action in national interests. But please note that Kautilya always suggested to avoid war as much as possible, because there are no guaranteed outcomes in a war. War means there would be tremendous loss of human lives and economic cost as well. But if diplomacy has failed, if coercive diplomacy has failed, if covert operations have failed, and if the king enjoys a military advantage against the enemy, then Kautilya suggested warfare is a justified option to achieve national interests. You can bring down your rivals with your military superiority and ensure that you win the war as quickly as possible through a swift and short conflict. Kautilya was against the prolonging of the conflict. Kautilya never believed that protracted conflict can give results. He strongly urged the king to fight a quick, swift, short war to achieve immediate results, to defeat the opponent and ensure that the interest of the nation is protected. This could be territorial interests, or it could be acquiring of resources, whatever it is. Acquiring and protecting those interests was prioritized as the sole objective of war. But however, Kautilya was a very thoughtful thinker, a far-sighted thinker. He advised to the king that even if you have military superiority and even if you have convincingly defeated the opponent, ensure that you don't unnecessarily destroy the prakriti or the very natural structure of the enemy. Don't destroy the very nature of the enemy, the basic structure of the enemy country. Don't humiliate the enemy. Don't use this opportunity where you have won the war and as a victor country, don't humiliate the defeated country. Kautilya advised that this could be counterproductive because it will only sow the seeds of hatred. Today the enemy might be defeated, but tomorrow this grievance, resentment might become a root cause for further hatred, and it could strengthen the resolve of the enemy to fight some other day, to come back as a much stronger threat few years or few decades later. So he strongly advised to the king to not celebrate these victories, to not humiliate the opponent and treat the opponent with generosity and leniency, so that tomorrow there might be an opportunity for Sandhi which could end the rivalry and enmity permanently. Now this is golden advice given by Kautilya. He said, war, if it becomes inevitable, you need to fight the war, especially when you have a military advantage and there is a genuine national interest involved. You should fight the war when it is imposed on us, but ensure that after you win the conflict, you don't destroy the very basic structure of the enemy. Don't occupy that country, don't break that country entirely, and ensure you give basic respect to the opponent. Treat them with generosity and leniency, and this was the advice given by Kautilya. Now we can see this being followed by India in the 1971 liberation of Bangladesh war. The Indira Gandhi government perfectly assessed the weakness of Pakistan, the internal weakness where Pakistan had committed atrocities against Bengalis. For India, it had become inevitable to fight a war against Pakistan using both overt and covert methods. So India resorted to the conflict only as a last resort after every other method had not worked. We tried the diplomatic route, coercive diplomacy, to highlight the atrocities Pakistani army was committing against the Bengalis. We were dealing with a massive refugee burden with more than 10 million refugees flowing into India. It was an opportunity for India as well to weaken Pakistan, which had become a challenging neighbor for India. So India waged a covert war as well to weaken and sabotage Pakistan internally, especially in East Pakistan. And eventually when Pakistan attacked India, that is when India went to war and defeated the country conclusively and split the country into two parts. But however, please remember, India did not destroy the very nature of Pakistan, the prakriti of Pakistan. Yes, we did split the country into two. A new country was born. Bangladesh was born out of East Pakistan. But India did not advance the war against West Pakistan. We didn't hold a single inch of territory of Pakistan from the West. The goal was very clear: to liberate East Pakistan and ensure the Bengalis are free and independent. Once the goal was achieved, India showed generosity and leniency. We agreed for negotiations and signed an agreement, the Shimla Agreement of 1972, through which we secured the independence of Bangladesh, pushed Pakistan to recognize Bangladesh as well, but we showed generosity in return by releasing the Pakistani POWs who were held in Indian custody. India never humiliated Pakistan deliberately. Even though Pakistan surrendered officially by signing the instrument of accession, India did not celebrate this victory to humiliate Pakistan. We treated all the Pakistani POWs, close to 95,000 Pakistani POWs, with great respect as per international law. We released them back into Pakistani custody, showing generosity and leniency. So this is how India handled the situation very maturely, and this is perfectly in line with what Kautilya had recommended under the six-fold policy for diplomacy, warfare and coercive diplomacy, or as we call it, Shadgunya. Now let's look at the other contrast. Let's look at the opposite of what we just discussed. If you go back to the world wars, if you see how the victors of World War behaved, the victors of World War I especially, many historians agree that the victors of World War I, essentially the Allied powers, Britain, France, etc., they went overboard with their victory. They deliberately caused humiliation to those defeated in the First World War. Especially Germany was the target. When the First World War was brought to an end in 1919 through the signing of Treaty of Versailles, the victors, that is Britain and France, they placed the entire responsibility and guilt of the war on Germany. They put the entire blame on Germany when there were other factors involved as well, which had led to the First World War. This caused humiliation and embarrassment to Germany and Germans in the subsequent years. Germany was forced to pay heavy reparations for triggering First World War. So by paying these reparations, Germany lost its economic strength. The colonies of the defeated powers were snatched away by Britain and France, and they distributed them between themselves as the spoils of war. They snatched away the colonies of Germany and the others who are aligned with Germany and distributed them amongst the victors, which was a clear selfish motive, a selfish agenda of Britain and France. So this humiliation caused to German pride and German identity the forceful payment of reparations, the snatching away of German colonies, and placing of the entire guilt and responsibility just on Germany caused so much humiliation and hurt to German pride and identity that this laid the eventual foundation. This laid the eventual foundation for the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, which paved the way for the Second World War. Many historians blame the victors of World War I, Britain and France, for laying the seeds of Second World War by meting out these humiliations and this embarrassment to Germany as a country and to the people of Germany. So Nazi Party, a far right-wing party, could build extreme nationalism. It could build nationalist support by promising that Germany's glory would be returned, Germany's pride and identity would be re-established. That is how Hitler could lead his propaganda and consolidate power in 1930s, eventually leading to the fascist German state that would not only persecute minorities like the Jews, but would eventually trigger the Second World War with devastating consequences. So if the victors of World War I had studied Kautilyan thought, if they had shown generosity, leniency, if they had not destroyed the Prakriti, the very basic structure of Germany, probably Second World War would have never happened. So that's something interesting to think about, just as an alternate course of history. Now coming to the next principle, asana or neutrality. Kautilya advised to the king that if you feel that the opponent is an equal power, if the opponent is neither superior nor inferior to you in terms of military, economic strength and geographical advantages, then treat them as equals and adopt a policy of neutrality. Even if there are tensions or clashes, ensure you maintain neutrality while you build your capabilities so that you emerge stronger and superior to your opponent. So you prepare for the future conflict and clashes, but for the time being, the king was advised to remain neutral, to stay away from conflicts, even if there are tensions, clashes and provocations present. Even if the enemy is provoking you, right? Even if the enemy is triggering the tensions leading to a potential conflict, the king was advised by Kautilya to show restraint, to not treat this as a matter of personal ego, to not treat this as a matter of emotional response, to keep away the need for an emotional response and follow a policy of restraint and neutrality to stay away from conflicts because your opponent is of equal power. Now, India has followed this doctrine in several instances in different ways and different forms. One, of course, would be the non-aligned movement that we championed during the Cold War period, when the whole world was divided between two superpower blocs, increasing tensions and laying the ground for a future global conflict. It was India which championed the path of neutrality with other like-minded countries. India wanted to champion a third neutral ideology between the democratic capitalist bloc led by the West and the US and the Eastern Communist Socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union. So India not only championed the cause of non-violence and diplomacy to avoid tensions, wars and conflicts, but we were very mindful of the fact that India is not really capable of taking on the global powers at that point. and India was very clear that it would follow an independent, autonomous foreign policy, that we would not side with either of the two superpowers. So if India had not followed the principle of non-alignment from 1950s all the way till at least 1970s, India would have been forced to choose sides, which possibly could have led to unnecessary conflicts with the allies of the other power bloc, right? And given that India had almost a similar status, a power status with the other allies, you never know how those clashes and tensions would have played out for India. So what India did was, very smartly, India championed a third neutral ideology focused on non-violence, focused on not escalating the tensions, while all the while being mindful of our own limited capabilities, right? And we worked with other countries, Indonesia, Ghana, Egypt, Yugoslavia, and all these leaders came together to champion the principle of non-alignment, which was truly a policy of asana, policy of neutrality. We have recently seen this as well in the India-Russia relations with regard to Russia-Ukraine conflict. Of course, India is not party to the conflict, but given the difficult choices we face between US and Western countries on one side and Russia on the other side, India has carefully navigated the middle path, the neutral path, by balancing out both the sides. We have stood with Russia, not criticizing Russia's war in Ukraine. We have bypassed the Western sanctions on Russia. We have bought Russian oil while focusing on mediation, while talking to both Russia and Ukraine and convincing the West as well that India's independent policy is necessary to bring this war to an end. So that again shows the policy of neutrality. Now, talking about a policy of restraint, I would like to cite one example from the year 2008, when India was hit by the 26/11 Mumbai attacks carried out by a Pakistani terror group, Lashkar-e-Toiba. Following this deadly attack, there was public outrage, media and opposition pressure on the then Manmohan Singh government to retaliate against Pakistan, to use the military option to punish Pakistan. And the option was even considered by the government. But however, the advice, the inputs at that point clearly pointed out that if India were to use the military option against Pakistan, leading to a possible war with Pakistan, such a scenario would be counterproductive to Indian interests. So based on this sound, logical, rational assessment, the then Prime Minister decided to use a policy of restraint, a type of neutrality, to stay away from the emotional urge to take revenge on Pakistan. Because leadership cannot be guided by emotions, cannot be guided by the need for revenge. It might satisfy the public need, but it might hurt the country's interests. Because see, there were many factors that influenced this decision. The government was even blamed at that point. People and media and the opposition ridiculed the government, saying India is a weak state. We never hit back at Pakistan or retaliate against Pakistan. But there was a deeper thought behind the decision, and this becomes clear when you read this remarkable book called Choices, written by Shiv Shankar Menon, the former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor of India. So during this critical, pivotal moment, Shiv Shankar Menon was the then Foreign Secretary. Later, he would become the National Security Advisor as well. So he writes in his book Choices that he personally advised to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and then Defence Minister Pranab Mukherjee to use the military option to retaliate against Pakistan. But the intelligence inputs were very clear. Pakistan deliberately wanted the escalation to happen. The deep state, the army and ISI were inviting India into a confrontation in order to achieve certain interests. Because see, prior to the attacks, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was successfully using a back channel diplomatic route to engage with Pakistani leader Pervez Musharraf. Through a secret back channel, the Indian and Pakistani leaders were talking to each other through their special envoys. And according to reports that came out later, India-Pakistan were very close to striking some important agreements. So intelligence inputs were very clear that maybe someone in the Pakistani establishment, in the army ISI establishment, they figured out the back channel diplomacy going on between Manmohan Singh and Pervez Musharraf and decided to break the relationship at any cost. That explains why such a large-scale attack was planned. And also possibly there was another motive. Within Pakistan by 2008, an internal crisis was brewing. All the terror and radical forces that Pakistan had cultivated, they were rebelling against Pakistani state, against the army and ISI. Because all the terror groups and radical groups were frustrated with how army and ISI were helping United States in Afghanistan to target Taliban and Al-Qaeda, whom they saw as their brother organizations. The Pakistani army and ISI were assisting United States. The ISI in particular was passing on intelligence to the CIA to help in the drone strikes being carried out in Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, where top Taliban Al-Qaeda leaders were being eliminated by the US. This had brought all the terror radical forces together. They were unhappy with the army and ISI, and they were rebelling against the Pakistani deep state. Some of you might remember the siege of Lal Masjid by the terror radical forces in Pakistan, which was threatening the very survival of the deep state in Pakistan. So maybe Pakistan planned this attack to create a diversion, to create an external enemy in the form of India by launching a major attack which would instigate India to retaliate, and then this excuse could be used by the deep state to unite all the terror and radical groups. Because imagine if India did go to war or use the military option against Pakistan at that point, in that context, Pakistan could have turned the narrative, could have brought all the terror radical forces together who were rebelling against the deep state. So India's assessment was absolutely clear that if India uses the military options at that point, the cost would be more for India. It wouldn't really punish Pakistan. The only thing we will get is an emotional satisfaction of revenge, which is never a desirable outcome. So India concluded that it's better to show public restraint but use other effective options to punish Pakistan. Just because India didn't use the military option doesn't mean India was silent, doesn't mean India stayed quiet after the attacks. Shiv Shankar Menon writes in his book Choices that as India decided not to use the military option, not to engage in an overt war, we engaged in covert operations and coercive diplomacy to punish Pakistan, which gave much better results for India. We brought out evidence to link the 26/11 Mumbai attacks with Lashkar in Pakistan and the ISI. We got global support in return, right? From US to European countries to even Saudi Arabia, UAE became key counter-terrorism partners for India, which helped India to isolate Pakistan. We could use platforms like UN and FATF to corner Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism, financing terrorism. And India also reportedly launched covert operations aimed at these terror groups to weaken the nexus between the Pakistani state agencies and the non-state actors. According to Shiv Shankar Menon, these options gave better results to India, and the public policy of restraint was beneficial for us because or else we would have served the Pakistani interests. The army ISI essentially wanted to instigate India to trigger tensions, including a possible conflict. So if India had done that, we would have essentially served the agenda of the Pakistani deep state. So with great assessment, the government decided to show a policy of restraint and employ other options away from the glare of the public to punish and weaken Pakistan, which gave long-term results for India. Now let's look at the policy of Yana or coercion. How the king was advised by Kautilya to coerce the enemy through military mobilization and through covert operations. The king was advised by Kautilya that if your adversary is stagnating with regard to their power status, or if their power status is on the decline, then this is an opportunity to further weaken them. He advised the king to exploit the opportunity. Imagine two states are equal powers and they are enemies of each other. So for the time being, the king would have adopted the policy of asana or neutrality because both are equal powers. But if there are developments in the enemy state, in the Ari state, which weakens the opponent, maybe an economic crisis or an internal social crisis or a political crisis, if you see that the enemy is weakening or stagnating, the king was advised by Kautilya to grab the opportunity and use military mobilization to threaten, to intimidate, to coerce the opponent to secure your interests, or even launch covert operations to sabotage the enemy, to weaken the enemy from within, and thus achieve your interests without even having the need to fight a full-fledged war. Now that is exactly what India did prior to the 1971 war. India did have enmity with Pakistan. We did have certain interest to secure against Pakistan. But India was never prepared for a full-fledged war. War was the last thing India wanted. Right? India, as a principle, is not a warmongering country. But as Pakistan perpetuated the crisis in East Pakistan and targeted the Bengalis, triggering a humanitarian crisis, a perfect opportunity opened up for India. India spotted the increasing social divisions, the internal strife, and the Indira Gandhi government authorized India's RAW, Research and Analysis Wing, to get deeply involved in the internal problems of East Pakistan. India would go on to support the Bengali liberation movement, not just the political phase of the movement led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, but India's RAW would even directly support the armed Bengali groups under Mukti Bahini, where India not only gave funds and arms and weapons, but even covert training was provided to the rebels, the Bengali rebels, who would fight back against Pakistani army and weaken Pakistan internally much before the war started. So this was clearly a policy of coercion. Recently, after the 2001 parliament attacks carried out by Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Vajpayee government attempted coercion through military mobilization by launching Operation Parakram to bring pressure on Pakistan, to threaten Pakistan with a possible war. The Vajpayee government mobilized the military troops for a surprise assault to teach Pakistan a lesson. But however, Parakram did fail in its objectives because Indian Army took a long time to mobilize the troops and the equipment. The initial strategy was to quickly mobilize within 48 hours of the attack and carry out surprise deep incursions into Pakistan to hold Pakistani territory and force Pakistan to negotiate over terrorism and push Pakistan to give up terrorism as a policy against India. The strategy was great. India employed the policy of coercion by mobilizing the troops, preparing for a possible war to intimidate the enemy. But however, the strategy did not yield complete results as desired by India. Due to logistical inefficiencies and the lack of resources, lack of planning, Indian Army took several weeks to achieve the mobilization, which allowed Pakistan also to counter-mobilize. But however, Operation Parakram did have an impact. It did intimidate Pakistan. It did bring global pressure on Pakistan as well. So though it was seen as a failure, it did help India to bring the pressure back on Pakistan, to bring that global focus and attention on Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism. Now coming to the next principle, samshaya or alliance, to seek shelter or refuge with others who are like-minded to counter your opponent and enemy. Kautilya advised to the king that if you are alone and if you are not able to take on the enemy on your own, and if the enemy is supposed to have superior status and advantages, then you need to form alliances with other like-minded states. Use the alliance for exerting coercive pressure and if required even offensive action against the common enemy. A classic example of this would be the Quad grouping formed by United States, Australia, Japan and India. The four like-minded maritime democracies of Indo-Pacific have come together to counter China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific, to enforce international rules and rules-based order on China, which is violating international law in the Indo-Pacific and threatening all these countries. So a grouping like the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is a classic example of formation of such alliances, and it's an implementation of the principle of samshaya. Coming to the last principle, Dvait Bhava or duplicity, or as we call it, diplomatic double game. In diplomacy, countries often promise something else, but in reality they'll do something else. This is quite deliberate. Many countries employ this strategy, including India. On the front, you make certain commitments to a country. It could be a friendly country or a udasina or a madhyama country, a country which is neutral or ignorant as well. Or it could be the Ari state, it could be the enemy state. So you make certain promises on the front, but behind the scenes, right, you employ parallel policies to weaken the opponent. So on one hand, you are trying to show yourself as a friend, but on the other side, you are trying to backstab that country. So this is the policy of duplicity, the policy of playing a double game, which is very common in geopolitics. So Kautilya advised to the king that engage both in Sandhi and Vigraha, use them parallelly, focus on peace, promise a peaceful initiative, talk to the other countries, try to work out a treaty, while you parallelly use the option of war, including covert options, to weaken the opponent, so that you throw the opponent off their balance. On one hand, you are promising friendship and cooperation. On the other hand, you are targeting them as well. Many countries have done this to India. Take United States for example. The US is known to play such double games against India. So if you look at examples in recent times, in 2016, Pakistan sponsored the Uri attacks against India, leading to heightened tensions. India retaliated by conducting surgical strikes against Pakistan. So there were heightened India-Pakistan military tensions from 2016 itself. When the Pulwama attacks happened in 2019, the tensions went further up and India retaliated with Balkot airstrikes and used the military option to punish Pakistan. But parallelly, what was India doing? Parallelly, we were trying to work out peace with China with regard to the Doklam standoff. Right? India realized that we can't escalate, because see, duplicity is not just about playing a double game with only one country. It could be about two countries as well, to avoid a two-front scenario. Duplicity could be about building peace with one enemy, whereas waging war with another enemy. Even this could be the meaning of Dvait Bhava. Either with one country, you are promising something and you are doing something else, essentially backstabbing them, right? Which is a very ruthless, cold-hearted form of diplomacy and warfare tactic. Or when you have two enemies, instead of fighting both of them simultaneously, which is a bigger challenge, you try to maintain peace with one enemy and go to war with the other enemy, or use aggressive options against the other enemy, so that you avoid a simultaneous conflict, a two-front threat. That is what India did. When tensions were heightened from 2016 to 2019 with Pakistan, right, we could use the military option confidently during the surgical strikes and the Balkot airstrikes, because we had struck peace with the other enemy, that is China. Given that China-Pakistan had a nexus between them, maintaining peace with China at that point was crucial. So despite the Doklam standoff, India had reached out to China, and through Sandhi, we had worked out a disengagement through Wuhan summit. This was followed up by the Mamlapuram informal summit. So as a result, India-China relations had become quite stable. So we had dealt with one enemy while using the military option against the other enemy, thus avoiding a two-front scenario, which is always a nightmare for India. This is the worst case scenario for India, having to fight a simultaneous conflict with Pakistan and China. So India attracted China through peace while targeting Pakistan with the military option. So that is also a game of duplicity, a diplomatic double game. This happens between India-US as well. See, India-US are very close partners and friends. We have a strategic partnership. They say this is the most defining partnership of the 21st century, which is true as well. At the same time, US works against Indian interests. India also sometimes works against American interests. This is quite common. The US continues its close friendship with Pakistan, continues military aid to Pakistan. It even supplies advanced weapons to Pakistan, which bothers India. Recently, US was trying to work against Indian interests in Bangladesh, and India countered the American policy. Though we are very good friends in our bilateral relationship, in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, we are quite often on the opposite sides. Similarly, the Khalistan issue is something that bothers India, and the US is apparently exploiting it, allowing a space for Khalistani extremists in Western countries, especially in US and Canada, to operate against India. So this has led to tensions and friction in the relationship. That's why you see a complicated relationship between India and US. A sort of a diplomatic double game is being played by US and by India as well. So this is the principle of Dvait Bhava advocated by Kautilya. Either you play a double game with two different enemies to avoid a two-front scenario, right? You maintain peace with one and fight against the other so that you're not involved in a two-front war, or with one country, right, where there is a complicated relationship with differing interests. On one side, you be friends with them, very good friends with them. On the other side, you work against them as well. And this is quite common in diplomacy, geopolitics, and covert warfare. So I hope it's been an interesting session, and I hope you guys have enjoyed and learned these key points. So if you want the PDF of this session, do join me on my Telegram channel, scan the QR code, and I will be sharing the PDF after the session goes live. So this brings me to the end of the session. Do let me know what you think about today's discussion, and do support the initiative with more likes and more comments. The more support we get, the more motivated we will be to run the series and extend the series. So do let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it. Thanks for watching.